Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I'm Steve, and we are a member of the Agora Podcast Network. We are on Facebook and Twitter, and you can find both by searching for A2Z History. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can always send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com, leaving a comment at the website, or direct messaging me on Facebook and Twitter. Now, as you well know, or hopefully know, we are back on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. We have several new patrons to commemorate in the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Paul at the Antioch level, Joran at Alexandria level, and Paul at the Constantinople level. Thank you to all of you who have signed up. The new and improved History of the Papacy Patreon is very similar to the old Patreon, but much better. You can follow the link in the show notes to search for the History of the Papacy on Patreon to find out more about all the great tiers. One great new benefit is you will receive audio of the YouTube video only content, the History of the Papacy in 10 minutes. You can watch them on my History of the Papacy podcast YouTube channel for free, but if you're a patron, you can listen to them on the patron bonus feed and have them on at your fingertips and in your earbuds. Did I mention we are on PayPal as well? And speaking of that, I want to thank Phil for his generous PayPal donation. You can find the link to my YouTube channel, History of the Papacy, in the show notes too. And we will have much more YouTube content in the coming months. Join us on YouTube, Patreon, PayPal, and everywhere else. You're always welcome, and I'm always appreciative of you listening, watching, and of all of your support. One more thing. I am doing another live stream event on August 6th, 2020. It will be available on Facebook and YouTube, the History of the Papacy YouTube channel. The time is still to be determined, but keep your eyes on Facebook and Twitter for more information. You can also support the live stream by becoming a sponsor of it. Email or direct message me on Facebook or Twitter if you'd like more information. Our goal for today's episode is to do the second half of the top 7 heresies of Christianity. Like I said in the last episode, some of the heresies we'll discuss happened before the late 700s, early 800s, and some had their beginnings in this time period and grew through the ages and would come into fruition later in the Middle Ages. We'll talk about Gnosticism, Christology, and much more. I highly suggest you go back and listen or watch the last episode, but you don't have to enjoy this one. But hey, why not? Anyways, let's start talking some heresy. Here we are with part 2 of our top 7 heresies of Christianity. We're going to look at numbers 3, 2, and then 1 today. Heresy is always a matter of perspective. One man's heresy is another man's orthodoxy, you might say. This works for religion equally with politics, academia, arts, sports, or any other discipline which requires taking a side or a position. Heresy is controversial and emotional in every way. The mainstream has to define the borders of their mainstream beliefs. Similarly, the outsider belief has to define its own intellectual borders in relation to the mainstream. That is how the difference between views becomes competing camps instead of marginal ideas inside of the mainstream. Orthodoxy and heterodoxy are always on a spectrum where a clear dividing line has been drawn, usually for specific groups and specific reasons. We'll explore a few of the heretical groups that developed and were defined against the Orthodox Christianity position. By orthodox, we'll take the baseline of pretty much mainstream sacramental Christianity. Sort of what evolved from what Bart Ehrman and others called proto-orthodoxy. I'm going to keep the baseline as rather general because in any debate over canonical versus uncanonical, the details matter, and I don't want to get completely bogged down in the details. Today's episode complements well with a two-part episode series that I've recorded called A Monument of Heresy, which was sidetrack episodes 43 and 44 respectively. And also this is part 2 of a 2-part series, like I said. So if you missed Heresies number 7 through 4, I highly suggest you go back and listen to the last episode to hear about Nestorianism, not one, but 2 phases of Gnosticism and iconoclasm. So some pretty big heresies right there. And you're going to see a lot more heresies today. Before we start, though, here's a quick review of what heresy is and what perspective we'll be taking on the topic and why we are talking about heresy. So what is heresy? Heresy is really the opposite of orthodoxy. Heresy comes from the word heterodox. Heterodoxy and orthodoxy both come from Greek roots. Orthos meaning right or true, meaning opinion, and doxa meaning opinion. So we have right or true opinion, and heterodox is the opposite, where it means heteros means other and doxa again means opinion. So heterodox means other opinion. It's really 2 ways of thinking, and opinions are either right or they're not right. When you boil it down, this is really how most issues play out. There's a spectrum, but ultimately a line's drawn on whether people agree or are on the same team or they are not. And then so I picked a top 7 because that's a little bit of a play on Christian numerology, and 7's very important in early Christian writings, especially in places like the Book of Revelation. And then you have the 7 cardinal virtues, the 7 deadly sins. I mean, you see 7 oftentimes in Christian numerology. Then quickly, the 3 main areas of disagreement in Christianity usually come down to Christology, and that really boils down to who Christ was, the main figure in the religion. Gnosticism, or the relationship between the material and the spiritual world. And then church practice and organization is basically what you do and how do you do it and who's in charge of it. Let's dive in and look at number 3 on our list, monophysitism. Monophysitism is on the 2-nature Christology spectrum. It's also on the Trinitarian spectrums of belief, with Nestorianism and Diophysitism, also known as Chalcedonianism. The opposite end of the spectrum from monophysitism is Nestorianism. Again, with most of the words we'll talk about, monophysitism comes from a Greek term, mono, meaning one, and physis, meaning nature. So one united nature. Some of the key thinkers in this Christology are Eutyches, Apollinaris of Laodicea, and a few others, but those are our 2 big guys. This is another one that was somewhat of a spectrum of belief. In monophysitism, Jesus only had one nature, a divine nature. Jesus's body was basically a jar that held his divinity, and the jar doesn't really count for much. It's what's inside of the jar that counts. Jesus' divine nature completely subsumed his human nature. An example that was used at the time is putting a drop of honey in the sea. All in all, this was separated from other ideas like adoptionism. Jesus actually was a separate hypostasis from God the Father, and in very short terms, a different person or identity, and a unique being from God the Father. He was the Word made flesh. He was not God filled into the body of a man and then left as just a husk after the crucifixion. Jesus was a man who existed in time, but he had these 2 natures in him. The human one doesn't count for much of anything. It's his God nature, but he was still his own man, so to speak, his own hypostasis of the Trinity. Now, we have to talk about something that's important here, and there's two kind of factions of monophysitism, or maybe we should more accurately say a group that gets lumped into monophysitism that really doesn't entirely agree with their conclusions, and that's called miaphysitism. Like I said, these two terms are intermingled, but they really are two distinct groups. Miaphysites, where mia comes from the indefinite article in Greek as opposed to mono, which really does mean one. Mia more means a single nature and doesn't exactly translate perfectly into English. These miaphysites believe that Jesus' two natures join together in something called a hypostatic union to form a new nature. It's kind of like mixing blue and red paint to get to the color purple. You can't separate the blue and the red once they mix, but they're both there. And kind of if you go back to our last episode with Nestorianism, they believed that the two natures really didn't mix, so that oil and vinegar and salad dressing metaphor, you can separate those, where the miaphysites are saying that they're inseparable because they formed a new nature, which is this hypostatic union. Monophysitism is really the extreme version because it plays down Christ's humanity to almost nothing. So it's important to keep those two ideas separate: monophysitism, miaphysitism. The showdown over this issue, though, of monophysitism and versus Chalcedonianism, or the mainstream of the Roman Empire, happened in the middle of the 400s. There was a back and forth between two nature and one nature Christologies. Who ran the show as the emperor really decided on what was the mainstream opinion in the Roman Empire. In 449, there was a Council of Ephesus, not what the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox would call the Ecumenical Council of Ephesus. That's a different council. But this 449 council, the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholics to this day call it the Council of Robbers, or the Robber Council. And this was orchestrated by the monophysites to support the one nature position. As it so happens, the Oriental Orthodox, the miaphysites of this day, really like this council, but that's another story. The Eastern and the Roman Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, they would say that this council just purely pushed monophysitism, but it was actually probably, technically speaking, more closely approaching something like miaphysitism. Now, go forward a couple of years, some things change in the Eastern Roman Empire, and it is still the Roman Empire at this time, but, let's not split hairs, but some things happen with the leadership. The Diophysite position becomes more popular, and there's something called the Council of Chalcedon, which is held in 451. The Pope of Rome at that time, Leo the Great, presented a great theological work called the Tome of Leo. And this is really a full-throated defense of two-nature Christology, Diophysitism. The official Roman Church, being represented by the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, accepted this council as ecumenical and just completely supported it. The miaphysites, who were mostly in Egypt at this point and spread throughout the Middle East, did not, and they broke off and became the Oriental Orthodox churches. The Copts, Armenians, Ethiopians, Syrian Jacobite churches, and others. And these churches are no longer in communion with the Eastern Orthodox or Roman Catholics, even though there are communications today between the two, but we'll set that to the side for the moment. So basically, these two groups at this point split off because they didn't agree on each other's definition of what was the mainstream belief, so they went their separate ways, even though they're really not that far apart. There was a council called the Fifth Ecumenical Council in 553, which tried to smooth out some of the differences between the Miaphysites and the Chalcedonians, but it just didn't quite work. Secular politics played as much of a role as religious, and why this rift never quite healed. The conflict between the Miaphysites and the Byzantine Imperial Church defined much of the history of the Eastern Church, really up until the Arab conquests. After the Arab conquests, much of the steam between the two sides in the fight really faded away. And at that point, there was really no reason to end the rift between the two sides at that point. So after this schism, there's really three main branches of Christianity. Eventually, let's identify the three branches. You have the Nestorians, the Miaphysites, and then the Roman Imperial Christianity, which would be destined to break up into the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholics. So these divisions would remain pretty stable until the Reformation of the 1500s, and Christianity would go through a major upheaval with the Protestant Revolution, particularly Western Christianity. This really didn't impact Eastern Christianity. So really up until the 1500s, I would argue, probably about 90% of Christians, maybe more, you were going to be initially three different groupings, which would eventually turn into four different groupings. And then once the Protestant Reformation hit the scenes, it would go into almost uncountable different groups. All right, let's hit up our number 2 on the list, the Waldensians. This is a group that's not very well known, and I think they really should be. They were a forerunner of the Protestants in the Reformation of the early 1500s. The Waldensians were a reforming movement that started all the way back in the late 1100s, and they gained popularity throughout the Middle Ages. They were founded in the southern France city of Lyon in the 1100s. Now, that's a little vague, but there's two origin stories, one more likely, and then one almost certainly legendary. Let's start with the legendary one. In the legendary story, St. Paul swung through southern France on his way to Spain, and he gave a select group of people the real deal Christianity. Once Constantine converted, the Catholic Church completely was corrupted, except for, of course, this one small group that St. Paul converted. And then the movement really came into full under a person named Peter Waldo. The end of that story is probably more close to the real story. Historically speaking, the Waldensians were founded by a merchant named Waldo, or some version therein, and he became Peter Waldo at a later time. Waldo started this reforming movement, really as a reforming movement of the Catholic Church. Believe it or not, the Catholic Church had run into a few rough centuries previous to this. Tons of corruption. But there were other reforming movements at this time. About a generation later, you'll see the Franciscans founded. And there's other similar movements, and all at a similar style. A lot of them revolved around mendicant, itinerant preaching, extreme vows of poverty, and then tenuous connection to the local church hierarchy. Some of these groups, like the Franciscans, did wind up joining the canonical mainstream eventually, though, but there were some rough patches for them. Other groups, like the Waldensians, did not. a synod or church council was held to try to get them in and get them regularized, these Waldensians. But eventually it didn't work out, and the Waldensians refused to join, if you will. Or maybe the two sides just couldn't come to an agreement. I mean, that happens too. Now, the Waldensian preachers spread the message, their own message, and their movement all over France, Spain, Italy, and even beyond during the Middle Ages. And we probably don't have to say this too much, but it bears repeating. The Middle Ages were a pretty brutal time in Europe. Both the civil and church authorities went after the Waldensians hardcore. They got lumped in with groups like the Cathar when those crusades got turned up on them. But they also, because these Waldensians had a distinct theology, even though they had some similar practices, they really can't get lumped in with the Cathars exactly. Let's talk about some of the individual practices of the Waldensians that maybe didn't quite jive with mainstream Roman Catholicism at the time. This whole idea of itinerant preaching by laymen was very unpopular amongst sacramental Christianity, be it in the East or in the West. They just did not like, the hierarchy did not like people preaching without theological training. Now you might say, well, they're speaking right to the people and, they're interpreting the Gospels in their own way. But, and at that time, a lot of people were not very well educated, and they may not have ever even read the Gospels. So they're just kind of firing it off without knowing what they're saying. And they very well could be stirring up without training and without the ability to read. They could be stirring up a lot of heresies that had already been kind of ironed out hundreds of years ago, and they're rekindling them. They also, the groups like the Waldensians, did not respect local church hierarchy. They believed that the Bible was the only tool a Christian needed to live by. And they also didn't believe that most of the sacraments were not necessary to live a Christian life. And they had a lot of different theological proofs for that. But again, without that theological training, at least by the hierarchy's perspective, they could, these groups like the Waldensians could be very much leading people into the worst possible things. They're leading people away from salvation, which would have been the worst thing you could do to somebody back in the Middle Ages. So that I think that the Roman Catholic Church and their hierarchy did have some legitimate concerns of where groups like these Waldensians were coming from. By the 1400s, the Waldensians got associated with other proto-Protestant acts like the Hussites and the Lollards. And those ones, I wish I could have included those in the list. The Hussites and the Lollards are definitely interesting groups in their own right. The Waldensians were faced with various amounts of persecution during this whole period. By the time of the Reformation, they wound up joining with the Protestants, and they were considered a Protestant or Reformed church, even though they were founded some 300 years before Martin Luther was even born. And it shows that the ideas, now that I think this is important, that it shows that the ideas of Martin Luther had been percolating around Europe for a long time before they came into full bloom with Martin Luther and afterwards. It's not like this idea of sola scriptura and all these things just kind of popped out of Martin Luther's brains. They were in this area and people were thinking and talking about them for a long, long time. Eventually, the Waldensians would get associated with the Calvinist Swiss reformer camp. And at that point, they wound up facing even more persecution. Now, in fairness, the 15 and the 1600s was an extremely unsettled time, and there was a much abuse of local populations to go around. So there was a lot of persecutions. the wars of the Reformation. A lot of blood was spilled during that, and it was really a much bloodier time than any other time in Christian history. The full power of states went against each other in the name of religion, Protestant versus Catholic, various forms of Protestant against Protestant, all of them against Catholics, sometimes groups of them with the Catholics against other Protestants. So it was just a really, really bloody and ugly time. For all of that, the Waldensians did survive, and there's a diaspora of them all around the world, all the way up until this day. All right, we're at number 1 now. Number 1 heresy of Christianity, which is Arianism, the heresy to beat all heresies. And I think it's worthy of number 1. Why would I say number 1 of a group that really doesn't even survive to this day? And it's really staying power. Arianism affected many, many major events in history for a long, long time. Obviously, Arianism gets its name from Arius of Alexandria, an early 4th century Egyptian priest. He didn't invent this theology, but he was a major popularizer of the ideology or theology. You may call him an influencer in the modern idiom. But before we go too far, what is Arianism? Really, Arianism was a blanket term for a full spectrum of beliefs. The true technical term is called subordinationism, in which Jesus and the Holy Spirit are somehow inferior to God the Father, as opposed to standard Trinitarianism where all three are equal. There's this technical term, homoousios, which is used by the Trinitarians, and it's where God the Father, Jesus, the Holy Spirit are all made of the same stuff, and that's the Trinitarian belief. Now, stuff is a technical term too, maybe not quite so much, but it's an easy term to use. It's essence and nature and some other philosophical terms were used, and it's very Aristotelian and Platonically connected to their philosophies. And it's not really necessary to get into all the nitty-gritty of this vocabulary, but this was how philosophers understood the way the world worked at the time. And it was really, at this time, it was the very highest of philosophical conversation going on. Now, the Arians believed that the three members of the Trinity were not made of the same stuff or essence at all. Most commonly, they believed they were made of similar stuff, homoousios, and in the most extreme view, they were made of all completely different essences or natures. Really, the mastermind behind this theology was a fellow named Eusebius of Nicomedia, and he's the person who really pushed the Arian message. He was the bishop of a town called Nicomedia, and then he was later bishop of Constantinople. So Eusebius knew how to find power. He's different than Eusebius of Caesarea or Caesarea, the church historian, but they were kind of related in their theologies, but that's a whole nother story. Eusebius of Nicomedia was actually the person who baptized Constantine, and he was, for most of his career, Constantine's key religious advisor. He was also the teacher of Ulfilas, who started the process of converting the Goths. Eusebius of Nicomedia and his disciple Ulfilas, or Wulfilas if you prefer, is where the real impact of Arianism comes in. Arianism was officially rejected at the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in 325. Both Arius and Eusebius were in attendance. Arius and Eusebius were censured for this belief, but Eusebius, being such a great politician, was able to get back into Constantine's good graces fairly quickly. Constantine and his immediate successors were Arians to one degree or another. During the rest of the 4th century, emperors supported pro-Arian policies, and most of the clergy, even though most of the clergy and the population were not Arians, so they were kind of fighting upstream on that one. Now, so there were some great disruptions in the empire caused by the Goths and the barbarian invasions. If you're listening to this podcast or watching this channel, you know that already. A new emperor would come to town named Theodosius, and he was a staunch Trinitarian Catholic. He put an end to Arianism in the Roman Empire, especially through a council, the Ecumenical Council of Constantinople in 381. And that officially rejected Arianism as the Roman imperial church position. But that was not the end of Arianism, though. Remember, the Goths adopted a version of Arianism from Wulfilas? Well, they spread that theology far and wide among barbarian tribes. Many of these tribes were fully Christianized before they even entered the empire, but as Arians. The Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, Vandals, Swabies, Alans, Lombards, you name it, Arians, either completely or significant portions of the population were Arian Christians. These groups would become ruling classes over the Trinitarian Catholic population for centuries. The Visigoths, for example, in Spain did not officially convert to Catholicism until 587. The Lombards in Italy, not until about 2 centuries later. Arianism was able to operate within a vast majority Catholic Orthodox population for 400 years and some change. In the end, they were a tiny minority ruling over a vastly larger population, which is always very, very difficult for that ruling class to keep their own beliefs and their own culture is almost impossible. Usually within a very few short generations, that group winds up blending into the population. But these Arians and Gothic Arians were able to keep some amount of independence and difference from themselves from the populations that they controlled and dominated for a long time. And I think that's one of the reasons why they deserve the number 1 place on this spot. That Arianism of them really was one of the main things that was allowing them to stay separate from this group that very easily could have subsumed them, which it did in many, many other places. The Arians didn't really influence the main population, but the main population, it took a long time for them to fully integrate these Gothic Arians into the larger population, even though it really was inevitable. More powerful groups like the Franks became Orthodox Catholic Christians. Eventually, the Lombards, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths were backed into the corner, and many factors were in place, not only the Franks, but many, many sociological factors were in place that really forced them to convert. And that was really the end of Arian theology. There are no direct followers of this position today. The Unitarian Christianity denomination is the closest to the Arians in theology, but there are significant differences in belief and practice, and like I said, no direct connection. There's about 700 or 800 years of history between the two groups. So, I mean, there's no connection between them. Just a slight agreement in theology. Well, that is all we have today. This was a really quick overview of a number of really interesting groups in the Christian religion. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. If you'd like to learn more, especially about Arians, Monophysites, Nestorians, Gnostics, I highly suggest you subscribe to the History of the Papacy podcast on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher such as Stitcher, etc. You, if you're listening to the podcast, if you want to see this in video form and other videos, great videos of both mine and many other podcasters and historians, you can subscribe to Nick Barksdale's The Study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages YouTube channel. And then remember to ring the bell, and they change the steps YouTube changes the steps constantly, but subscribe and make sure you're getting notifications. And if you're already subscribed, just go back and enjoy hours and hours dedicated to all these very interesting and fascinating heresies and much more. And I look forward to talking to you next time.